There are places on Earth that no human has ever seen, not because they are imaginary, but because they are hidden, buried beneath miles of water, erased by time, dissolved into stone and sediment. When we look out across the oceans, we see emptiness, but the oceans are not empty. They are archives, and like all archives, they keep secrets. Imagine standing on a shoreline tens of thousands of years ago. The sea is lower. Vast plains stretch where water now exists. Islands connect to continents. The horizon looks different. The world feels larger, more open, more mysterious. And then slowly or sometimes suddenly it changes. The water rises, the land disappears, memory fades, stories remain. Every civilization has stories of lands that were lost, islands swallowed by the sea, cities destroyed in a single night, peoples who vanished without a trace. These stories are older than modern science, older than written history itself, and yet they persist. Across cultures that never met, never shared maps, never exchanged ideas, the same haunting themes appear again and again. A great flood, a fallen world, a golden age erased. Why do humans, separated by oceans and millennia, remember the same kind of loss? Tonight we begin a long journey, one that moves slowly, deliberately, and carefully through the myths, the evidence, the misunderstandings, and the truths behind the idea of lost continents. Not just Atlantis, not just Lemuria, but the deeper question beneath them both. What if the Earth itself remembers more than we do? Long before satellites mapped the seafloor, long before geology explained the movement of continents, long before science had language for deep time, humans already believed that entire worlds could vanish. To ancient people, the sea was not merely water. It was a boundary, a devourer, a force that erased land, history, and life without warning. When coastal settlements flooded, when storms destroyed cities, when earthquakes caused shorelines to collapse, the explanation was not gradual change, it was catastrophe. And catastrophe leaves scars in memory. These memories became stories, stories became myths, myths became warnings. They spoke of civilizations that grew proud, powerful, advanced, and were destroyed for their arrogance, or forgotten because of forces beyond their control. These stories were told by firelight, passed from elders to children, reshaped with each generation but never truly lost. Over time, the details blurred, but the core remained. There was land, there were people, now there is sea. When writing was invented, these ancient oral traditions found new form. They were recorded, preserved, and given names, and among them one name would echo louder than all others: Atlantis. But Atlantis did not appear in isolation. It emerged from a world already rich with flood myths, lost lands, and submerged memories. To understand Atlantis, we must first understand why humans expect such a place to exist at all. The Earth is not static. It never has been. Sea levels rise and fall. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Continents drift. Volcanoes build land and erosion destroys it. Over the last 120,000 years alone, global sea levels have risen more than 120 meters. That is not a small change. That is enough to drown coastlines, valleys, islands, and entire land bridges. Where there is water today, there was once land, and where there is land today, there was once water. Modern humans evolved during a time when the world looked very different. They hunted across plains that no longer exist. They lived near coastlines that are now submerged far offshore. Their sacred places, their burial grounds, their earliest settlements, many now lie beneath the ocean. When the last ice age ended, the seas rose faster than at almost any other time in human history. In some regions, shorelines advanced inward by meters per year. To people living through it, this would not have felt slow. It would have felt like the world was ending. Imagine generations watching the sea creep closer. Imagine villages abandoned. Imagine familiar landscapes erased. And then imagine trying to explain this loss to your children. You would not describe millennia, you would describe a great flood. You would speak of lands that sank. This is the psychological soil from which lost continent myths grow. Atlantis, as most people know it today, comes to us through a single voice, one philosopher, one writer, one storyteller who lived more than 2,000 years ago, Plato. In his dialogues, he describes a vast island civilization, rich, powerful, technologically advanced, located beyond the known world. According to the story, Atlantis was once greater than all the kingdoms of the Mediterranean combined. Its people mastered engineering, built massive canals, extracted metals from the earth, and commanded the sea itself. But Atlantis fell. In a single day and night, the island was destroyed by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the ocean and becoming impassable forever. To many readers across history, this sounded less like a myth and more like a memory. But Plato never claimed to witness Atlantis himself. He said the story was ancient even in his time, passed down through Egyptian priests, told to Greek lawmakers, repeated across generations. Already we are dealing with layers of retelling, and yet the details are strangely specific. Circular cities, harbors, and canals, a sudden cataclysm, a moral lesson about hubris. Was Plato inventing a story to make a philosophical point, or was he preserving something far older than he realized? This question has haunted scholars, mystics, and scientists for centuries. Some dismiss Atlantis entirely as allegory, metaphor, or fiction. Others insist it was real but misplaced. Some search the Atlantic, others the Mediterranean. Some look toward the Caribbean, others toward Antarctica. The problem is not imagination, the problem is evidence. Geology tells us that continents do not simply sink overnight. Tectonic plates move slowly. Land subsides gradually. Sudden collapse on a continental scale is not supported by known Earth processes. But that does not mean nothing sank. It means we may be looking in the wrong way. While Atlantis emerged from philosophy and myth, another lost continent came from science itself. Lemuria. Unlike Atlantis, Lemuria was not born in a story. It was born in confusion. In the 19th century, long before plate tectonics was understood, scientists noticed something strange. Fossils of lemurs, primitive primates, were found in Madagascar and India, but not in the regions between them. How could this be? To explain it, scientists proposed a land bridge, a vast continent stretching across the Indian Ocean connecting Africa, Madagascar, and India. They named it Lemuria after the animals that inspired it. At the time, this was reasonable science, but science evolves. When continental drift was discovered, Lemuria became unnecessary. India had once been joined to Madagascar. The fossils made sense. The continent was no longer needed. Lemuria should have disappeared quietly from scientific thought. Instead, it transformed. Philosophers, mystics, and spiritual movements adopted Lemuria and reshaped it. They imagined it not as a land bridge, but as a lost civilization, a peaceful, enlightened society, a predecessor to humanity as we know it. Some claimed its people were giants. Others said they were psychic beings. Others believed Lemuria was humanity's true origin. Science had let go, myth had taken over, and here we reach a critical moment in our journey. Atlantis began as myth and tempted science. Lemuria began as science and became myth. Both represent something deeper than geography. They represent a human suspicion that history is incomplete, that something has been forgotten, that the story we tell ourselves about our past may be missing entire chapters. The story of Atlantis does not begin with stone walls or sunken cities. It begins with memory, with fragments of events too large, too traumatic, too ancient to be recorded precisely. What survives is not a map but a shape, not a location but a pattern. When Plato tells the story, he frames it carefully. He does not say, "This is a myth." He says, "This was told to Solon by Egyptian priests from records far older than Greece." Whether this was true or not almost misses the point. What matters is that Plato presents Atlantis as inherited knowledge, not invention, as something remembered, not imagined, and that distinction matters deeply, because myths that are purely invented tend to drift wildly. They mutate, they lose coherence, but the Atlantis story remains strangely structured. It has geography, it has chronology, it has cause and effect, it has a rise and a fall, and most importantly, it has destruction. The destruction of Atlantis is not slow. It is not symbolic, it is sudden. Violent, final, the land sinks, the sea swallows, passage becomes impossible, memory breaks. This kind of ending is not the ending of a fairy tale, it is the ending of a disaster. Throughout human history, catastrophic events leave the deepest marks on collective memory, not because they are rare, but because they change everything at once. Floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. These are the events that redraw maps, erase borders, and silence entire cultures. And when such events occur before writing, they survive only as stories. Stories told by those who escaped, stories shaped by fear and awe, stories that carry truth but not precision. If Atlantis reflects anything real, it may not reflect a single place. It may reflect many places, many disasters, compressed into one narrative, one name. Consider the ancient Mediterranean world. This region sits atop some of the most unstable geology on Earth. Tectonic plates collide here. Volcanoes erupt, earthquakes shake entire coastlines. The sea itself is restless. Around 1600 BCE, one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history occurred on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. The explosion was so immense that it reshaped the island, sent ash across continents, and triggered massive tsunamis throughout the Aegean Sea. Coastal settlements were destroyed, harbors vanished, ships were shattered, entire communities disappeared. At the time, one of the most advanced civilizations in the region was the Minoans. They were master sailors, engineers, traders. They built complex cities with plumbing, roads, and vibrant art. Their power depended on the sea, and the sea turned against them. The eruption did not instantly wipe out the Minoans, but it weakened them. Trade collapsed, crops failed, political structures destabilized. Within a few generations, their civilization faded. No single event destroyed them. But the memory of catastrophe would have lingered. Now imagine this memory being retold centuries later, across languages, across cultures, simplified, condensed. A powerful sea-based civilization, destroyed suddenly by natural forces, gone beneath the waves. The shape of Atlantis begins to emerge, but there is a danger here, a subtle one. When we try to find Atlantis in one historical event, we may be missing the larger truth. Atlantis may not be a photograph of the past, it may be a mosaic. A composite of disasters remembered as one, and this would explain why it feels real but remains elusive. There is another reason Atlantis refuses to disappear. It is not just a story of destruction, it is a story of warning. Plato describes Atlantis as powerful, wealthy, and technologically capable, but he also describes its downfall as moral. The Atlanteans grow arrogant, they lose balance, they forget humility, and nature or the gods correct them. This theme appears everywhere in human storytelling. When civilizations fail, we rarely accept randomness. We search for meaning, we assign cause, we moralize disaster. Floods become punishments, earthquakes become judgments, collapse becomes consequence. This does not mean people were naive, it means they were human. The idea that great power carries great risk is not ancient, it is eternal, and Atlantis embodies that fear perfectly. It says no matter how advanced you become, the earth is still stronger. But if Atlantis represents memory filtered through philosophy, Lemuria represents memory filtered through misunderstanding. The scientists who proposed Lemuria were not mystics. They were naturalists trying to explain evidence with the tools available to them. They saw patterns in fossils and geography and reached for the best explanation they had. They did not imagine temples or cities or advanced beings. They imagined land. But once the land existed in theory, imagination took over. And this is where something fascinating happens. Humans do not like empty continents. If land exists, we populate it. If a continent is lost, we ask who lived there. And if science cannot answer, myth will. Lemuria, once stripped of its scientific purpose, became a canvas. Onto it were projected hopes, fears, spiritual longings, and dissatisfaction with modern life. In a world increasingly shaped by industrialization and materialism, Lemuria became a symbol of something purer, older, more harmonious. A civilization that lived in balance with nature and was destroyed not by arrogance but by cosmic cycles. In this sense, Lemuria is the mirror image of Atlantis. Atlantis is the warning against hubris. Lemuria is the longing for innocence. One falls because it grows corrupt, the other falls because the world changes. Both express grief. Grief for something lost. At this point, it is tempting to dismiss everything as fantasy. To say these stories tell us nothing about the real earth and everything about the human mind, but that would be too simple, because beneath the myths, beneath the exaggerations and spiritual overlays, there is a solid, undeniable truth. Land really has been lost, not imagined land, real land. During the last ice age, vast regions of the planet were exposed that are now submerged. Entire coastlines lay dozens or even hundreds of kilometers farther out than today. Humans lived on those lands, they hunted there, traveled there, died there. When the ice melted, those lands did not vanish in a single night, but they vanished within the span of human memory. And memory does not record gradual change well. Memory remembers beginnings and endings. It remembers land and then water. In places like Southeast Asia, a massive landmass once connected modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and mainland Asia. In Europe, land bridges connected Britain to the continent. In the Americas, coastlines extended far beyond their current limits. These were not small regions. They were worlds that are now underwater. If future civilizations found only fragments of our cities, submerged highways, collapsed buildings, scattered artifacts, they might tell stories too. Stories of a world that fell. Stories of arrogance and collapse, stories of sudden loss. They might call it a myth. There is another layer to this story, one that makes people uncomfortable. If humans lived on now submerged lands, then the archaeological record is incomplete. Most archaeology happens on land. Most ancient coastlines are now underwater. This means the oldest chapters of human civilization may lie beyond our reach, not because they are fictional, but because they are submerged. Underwater archaeology has already revealed ancient settlements beneath the sea, stone structures, tools, foundations older than many known civilizations. These finds do not prove Atlantis or Lemuria, but they prove something equally important. They prove that advanced organization, construction, and culture existed earlier than we once believed, and every discovery pushes the boundary further back. This does not mean there was a globe-spanning lost super-civilization. But it does mean human history is deeper, more complex, and more fragile than we assumed. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and sometimes the earth erases the evidence. So where does this leave us, between myth and science, between skepticism and wonder? Atlantis and Lemuria, taken literally, almost certainly did not exist as described. No vast continent sank overnight. No advanced global civilization vanished without trace. But taken symbolically, they may be more truthful than we realize. They tell us that humans remember loss. They tell us that the earth changes faster than cultures expect. They tell us that knowledge can disappear. And they tell us that the sea is not just water, it is forgetting. The idea that continents can be lost sounds dramatic, almost mythical, until science quietly confirms that it has already happened, not in a single night, not in a divine punishment, but through slow, relentless processes that are far more powerful than any legend. Beneath the oceans lie vast regions of continental crust, thick, ancient, and unmistakably different from the thin basalt of the deep seafloor. These are not fragments of imagination. They are measured, mapped, drilled, and studied. They are real. For centuries, humans assumed continents were fixed, immutable, permanent features of the earth. Mountains rose, rivers shifted, coastlines eroded, but the great landmasses themselves were thought eternal. This assumption shaped how myths like Atlantis were judged. If continents could not move or sink, then stories of lost lands had to be fiction. But the earth does not care about assumptions. When plate tectonics emerged in the 20th century, it shattered the idea of permanence. Continents were revealed to be travelers, slow-moving, yes, but constantly in motion. Colliding, splitting, stretching, thinning, sometimes rising, sometimes sinking, and sometimes almost entirely disappearing beneath the sea. One of the most striking examples lies in the southern Pacific, a landmass nearly as large as India. 94% submerged, its mountains drowned, its plateaus flooded, its coastlines erased. For most of human history, it was invisible. Only recently did science acknowledge what it truly was, a continent, not a myth, not a hypothesis. A continent in every geological sense, thick crust, distinct boundaries, ancient rock. It sank slowly over tens of millions of years, not because it was punished, not because it collapsed, but because the forces shaping the planet demanded it. This changes everything, because once we accept that continents can be lost quietly, gradually, almost completely, the stories of lost lands no longer sound absurd. They sound incomplete. But here is where we must be careful. There's a profound difference between geological loss and cultural memory. A continent can sink without anyone noticing if no one is there to witness it. What makes Atlantis and Lemuria compelling is not merely that land was lost, but that it was remembered. And memory requires observers, which brings us back to humans. Modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. For most of that time, they lived as hunter-gatherers, deeply connected to their environments. They followed coastlines, they relied on rivers, they settled near water, and they were extraordinarily sensitive to environmental change. They had to be. A shifting shoreline could mean starvation or survival. Rising water could erase hunting grounds. A collapsing coast could destroy generations of accumulated knowledge. When such changes occurred, they were not abstract, they were personal. A flooded valley was not sea level rise. It was home, gone. Now imagine this happening not once, but repeatedly. Across thousands of years, across continents, across cultures. At the end of the last ice age, the Earth entered a period of dramatic transformation. Ice sheets melted, sea levels rose rapidly. In some regions, the ocean advanced inland by kilometers within a single lifetime. For the people living through it, the world was shrinking. Land disappeared, islands formed, familiar paths vanished, burial sites were submerged, sacred places lost. And the most terrifying part was that it did not stop. The sea kept coming. How would you explain this to your children? You would not speak of ice sheets and thermal expansion. You would speak of a great flood, of land taken by the ocean, of a time before the water rose, and if you were asked why it happened, you might say the gods were angry, or the world had lost balance, or people had forgotten how to live correctly, not because it was true, but because it made sense. Meaning is how humans survive chaos. This is why flood myths are everywhere. They are not evidence of a single global catastrophe. They are evidence of a shared human experience, the experience of loss. When coastal peoples across the world tell stories of submerged lands, drowned cities, and vanished worlds, they are not coordinating. They are remembering. Each story is local, each disaster unique. But over time, as stories travel and merge, patterns emerge. A great land once existed. It was prosperous. It was destroyed. Few survived. The world was never the same. This structure is not accidental. It mirrors trauma. Trauma compresses time. It simplifies complexity. It amplifies cause and effect, and it demands explanation. Atlantis fits this structure perfectly. Lemuria too, though in a different way. Lemuria does not fall suddenly. It fades. It is lost to cycles, to inevitability, to forces beyond control. It represents not punishment, but impermanence. Together, they reflect two ways humans understand loss, one through blame, the other through acceptance. Yet there is still a question that refuses to go away. If humans lived on submerged lands, and if some of those lands were large, resource-rich, and stable for thousands of years, could complex societies have emerged there, not global empires, not spacefaring civilizations, but organized, sophisticated cultures that predate known history? This is not fantasy, it is possibility. Archaeology has already shown that human societies became complex far earlier than once believed. Monumental structures, long-distance trade, astronomical knowledge, all appearing thousands of years earlier than expected. And this was discovered on land. What remains undiscovered beneath the sea? Underwater archaeology is still in its infancy. The ocean is vast, exploration is expensive, visibility is limited, and much of the seafloor remains unmapped at high resolution. What we have found so far are hints, stone tools beneath ancient shorelines, walls and foundations off modern coasts, submerged settlements preserved by sediment. These finds do not rewrite history yet, but they challenge our certainty. They suggest that the timeline of human development may be longer, that early experiments in civilization may have risen and fallen before the agricultural societies we know, not because they were wiped out by gods, but because they were coastal. And the coast did not survive. This is where the idea of lost continents becomes psychologically dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it invites exaggeration. When evidence is incomplete, imagination rushes in. Suddenly, every submerged ruin becomes Atlantis. Every unexplained artifact becomes proof of a vanished super-civilization. Every gap in knowledge becomes conspiracy. This is how myth overtakes inquiry. But rejecting exaggeration does not require rejecting mystery. We can acknowledge that large-scale, advanced global civilizations almost certainly did not exist tens of thousands of years ago, while also admitting that human history is far less linear than we once thought. Civilization may not be a single upward climb. It may be a series of experiments, some successful, some fragile, some erased. And when those experiments ended, memory carried forward only fragments that became stories. There is another reason lost continent myths persist. They speak to modern anxiety. We live in an age of technological power, of global connectivity, of environmental instability, of rising seas. For the first time, the fate described in ancient myths feels possible again. Coastal cities flood, ice melts, storms intensify, maps change. Atlantis stops feeling like a legend and starts feeling like a warning. Not because it happened before exactly as told, but because it could happen again in a form we recognize. The myth endures because it adapts. Every generation sees itself reflected in Atlantis, a powerful society, confident in its mastery, blind to its vulnerability, and the sea, patient and indifferent, waits. As we move deeper into this journey, the boundary between myth and geology grows thinner, not because myths are literally true, but because they encode truths in symbolic form. They tell us that land is not permanent, that memory is fragile, that knowledge can vanish, that nature does not negotiate. When we imagine the seafloor, we often picture emptiness, an endless plain of darkness, pressure, and silence, but this image is deceptive. Beneath the waves lies a landscape as varied as any on land: mountains, valleys, cliffs, plateaus, river channels, and plains shaped by forces both ancient and ongoing. These submerged landscapes were not always underwater. They were carved by wind and rain, shaped by rivers, walked by animals, crossed by humans. They hold the same geological signatures as dry land because they were once dry land, and that is where the story becomes unsettling. Because the seafloor preserves history differently than land does. On land, erosion destroys. On the seafloor, sediment buries. What falls beneath the ocean is often sealed, protected from wind, weather, and human interference. In some cases, underwater preservation is better than on land. This means the ocean is not just a graveyard of lost worlds, it is a vault. To understand what might be hidden beneath the sea, we must first understand how landscapes disappear. Sea level does not rise evenly. It rises in pulses, sometimes slowly, sometimes in dramatic surges. During the end of the last ice age, there were periods when melting accelerated suddenly, releasing vast amounts of water into the oceans in a relatively short time. To people living along coastlines, these pulses would have been terrifying. Shorelines would advance inland, estuaries would flood, river valleys would become bays, islands would shrink, fragment, or vanish entirely. And crucially, the most desirable places to live, flat, fertile coastal plains, were the first to go. Humans do not settle randomly. They choose places with water, food, trade access, and mild climates. Coastlines offer all of this. They are crossroads, they are abundant, they are forgiving, until they are not. When the seas rose, people moved. They retreated inland, they adapted, but they could not carry everything with them. Structures were abandoned, settlements were left behind, sacred places were lost, and over generations memory faded, but the land itself did not vanish. It was simply drowned. Modern technology has begun to peel back the ocean's surface layer by layer. Sonar mapping, satellite measurements, and submersible exploration have revealed vast submerged features that mirror terrestrial landscapes. Ancient river systems stretch across the seafloor, complete with branching channels and floodplains. Hills and ridges rise where mountains once stood. Flat expanses resemble plains where humans could have lived, hunted, and built. These are not random shapes. They are the fingerprints of former worlds. In some places, these submerged landscapes are enormous, far larger than any single island. They represent regions that were stable for tens of thousands of years before being lost. This stability matters. Civilization does not emerge overnight. It requires time, predictability, generations of accumulated knowledge, a land that remains above water long enough for culture to take root. Many submerged regions meet this requirement. Which means the question is no longer whether humans lived there. They did. The question is what they built. Here is where caution becomes essential. There is a temptation to imagine grand cities beneath the waves, towering monuments, vast temples, advanced machines waiting to be rediscovered. This image is powerful, cinematic, and almost certainly wrong. Early human societies were complex but not magical. Their technologies were appropriate to their time and environment. Stone, wood, bone, fiber. Materials that do not always survive immersion. If coastal societies existed on now submerged lands, much of what they built may be gone. Wood rots, fibers dissolve, even stone can shift, collapse, or be buried beyond recognition. What remains are fragments, foundations, tools, patterns, and patterns are difficult to interpret without context. A line of stones might be a wall, or it might be natural. A submerged formation might be a structure, or it might be erosion. Distinguishing between the two requires patience, skepticism, and restraint. This is where myths often rush ahead of evidence, but evidence, when approached carefully, is enough. Consider this: if we removed modern cities from the land and submerged them for thousands of years, what would remain? Skyscrapers would collapse, steel would corrode, concrete would fracture, roads would vanish beneath sediment, plastics would fragment, electronics would decay. What would survive would be outlines. Unusual concentrations of material, geometric anomalies. Future explorers might argue endlessly about whether these were natural or artificial. They might invent stories. They might dismiss the idea entirely. They might be wrong. This is the position we are in now, looking back at our own deep past. The myth of Atlantis speaks of sudden destruction, but archaeology suggests something subtler and more disturbing. Loss does not have to be dramatic to be total. A society can decline quietly. As coastlines retreat, people move, trade routes change, resources shift, cultural centers relocate, knowledge fragments. What was once central becomes peripheral. What was once powerful becomes forgotten. No cataclysm is required, only time. This kind of loss leaves little trace in myth because it lacks spectacle. But it leaves deep scars in archaeology because it creates gaps, places where we expect continuity and find none. These gaps are where speculation thrives. And sometimes speculation points in the right direction. The idea that human history contains missing chapters is no longer controversial. What is controversial is how many chapters are missing. For much of the 20th century, the dominant narrative was simple. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, then suddenly agriculture appeared, followed by civilization. This story is neat, linear, comfortable, and wrong. Evidence now shows that humans experimented with sedentary life, monument building, symbolic expression, and complex social organization long before agriculture was fully established. These experiments were not isolated anomalies. They were widespread, and many of them occurred near coastlines, which are now underwater. This does not mean there was a single lost global civilization. It means there were many local experiments, some successful, some short-lived, whose traces are unevenly preserved. The ocean erased some, the land preserved others. We see the survivors and mistake them for the beginning. Atlantis and Lemuria become dangerous only when we force them to be literal. When we demand exact locations, perfect descriptions, and advanced technologies far beyond their time, we lose what they are actually telling us. They are not maps, they are metaphors, metaphors for loss. For impermanence, for the fragility of knowledge. Atlantis tells us that power does not guarantee survival. Lemuria tells us that harmony does not guarantee permanence. Together they tell us that the earth does not care who we are. It moves, it changes, it reshapes itself, and we adapt or we disappear. There is a quiet irony here. The more we learn about the earth, the less fantastical the idea of lost worlds becomes. Not because myths were accurate, but because reality is stranger than myth. Entire ecosystems have vanished, entire landmasses have drowned, entire species have disappeared without ceremony. Why would human cultures be exempt? The only difference is that humans remember, and memory seeks narrative. As underwater exploration advances, we will find more, not proof of Atlantis as Plato described it, not Lemuria as mystics imagined it, but evidence of human presence where we did not expect it. older settlements, older tools, older adaptations. Each discovery will shift the timeline slightly, extend it backward, complicate the story, and with each shift the space between myth and science will narrow, not because myth becomes true, but because it becomes understandable. The stories we told were not lies, they were translations, translations of experience into meaning. The fascination with lost worlds does not come from curiosity alone, it comes from recognition. Somewhere beneath the layers of myth, science, and speculation, the idea of vanished continents touches something deeply human. It is not just about land disappearing. It is about the fear that meaning itself can be erased. Humans are the only species that knows it will be forgotten. We build monuments not because we need them, but because we fear disappearance. We carve stone, raise cities, write stories, and bury the dead with care because we want to be remembered. Lost continents terrify us because they suggest that even memory can fail, that even greatness can dissolve without a trace. Atlantis and Lemuria endure because they threaten the most fragile assumption we make about history, that progress is permanent and knowledge accumulates without loss. But history does not work that way. Knowledge is not guaranteed, it is carried by people. When people disappear, knowledge goes with them. And when environments change faster than societies can adapt, entire ways of life vanish silently. This is not speculation, it has happened repeatedly. Every civilization believes it is standing at the center of time, that it represents the highest point so far, that everything before it led inevitably to the present moment. This belief is comforting. It gives meaning to effort. It frames history as a ladder. But the archaeological record does not show a ladder, it shows waves. Cultures rise, flourish, fragment, and fall. Skills are gained and lost. Techniques are forgotten and rediscovered. What seems advanced in one era may vanish in the next, only to reappear thousands of years later under different names. Lost continent myths tap into this unsettling reality. They whisper that history is not a straight line. They suggest that we are not the first to stand on the edge of the sea and believe we understand the world. Psychologically, Atlantis occupies a unique space. It is both familiar and alien. It is described as advanced, organized, powerful, yet utterly vulnerable. It feels modern enough to be relatable, ancient enough to be unreachable. This tension is deliberate. Atlantis is not meant to be distant, it is meant to be a mirror. Every generation that retells the story reshapes Atlantis in its own image. In the Renaissance, it was a lost classical civilization. In the industrial age, it became technologically advanced. In the modern era, it is often imagined as globally connected, scientifically sophisticated, and environmentally careless. Atlantis evolves because fear evolves. What remains constant is the ending. It always falls. Lemuria, by contrast, does not mirror our fears of power. It mirrors our longing for harmony. It is often imagined as peaceful, spiritually enlightened, and deeply connected to nature. Its destruction is framed not as punishment, but as tragedy, an inevitable loss in a changing world. This reflects a different anxiety, not that we will destroy ourselves through excess, but that something gentle and beautiful has already been destroyed and we are too late to save it. Lemuria represents the fear that innocence is fragile, that balance is temporary, that even the most harmonious societies cannot survive geological time. Together, Atlantis and Lemuria form a psychological pair. One warns against arrogance, the other mourns impermanence. Both tell us that the earth does not preserve intention. This is why these myths resurface most strongly during periods of upheaval. When societies feel stable, they look forward. When societies feel uncertain, they look back. The past becomes a refuge or a warning. In times of environmental stress, lost continent stories gain power because they offer a narrative framework for anxiety. They say, this has happened before. Others have faced this. Others have failed, and in that sense, they prepare us. There is another uncomfortable reason these myths persist. They challenge human exceptionalism. Modern culture often assumes that technological sophistication protects us. That knowledge makes us immune to collapse, that we are different from those who came before. Lost continent myths say otherwise. They say that intelligence does not guarantee survival. That complexity creates vulnerability. That interdependence magnifies collapse. A simple society can fail locally. A complex society can fail globally. This is not mythology, it is systems theory. The more interconnected a system becomes, the more efficient it is and the more fragile. Atlantis collapses not because it is weak, but because it is powerful enough to depend on itself. This is why the story feels modern. At a deeper level, lost worlds speak to the human relationship with time. We experience time as linear, past, present, future. But geological time is not linear in a way that favors memory. It is cyclical, recursive, indifferent. Mountains rise and fall, seas advance and retreat. Life appears, adapts, and vanishes. From the perspective of the earth, civilizations are brief patterns. From the perspective of humans, they are everything. Lost continents force us to confront that disparity. They ask us to imagine a world where our cities are sediments, our languages are vibrations long dissipated, and our achievements are indistinguishable from natural formations. This is not nihilism, it is humility. When people search obsessively for Atlantis or Lemuria, they are often searching for reassurance, proof that something was known before us, that wisdom existed and was lost, that we are not alone in history. But this search can turn destructive when it becomes denial. Denial that the future is uncertain. Denial that collapse is possible. Denial that knowledge can be fragile. Myth becomes dangerous when it replaces responsibility. But myth becomes valuable when it deepens awareness. What if Atlantis is not a place to be found, but a scenario to be avoided? What if Lemuria is not a civilization to be rediscovered, but a reminder of what is always temporary? Then their value is not in their existence, but in their meaning. They teach us to think in deep time, to respect the planet's rhythms, to understand that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. As we stand at the edge of rising seas, melting ice, and shifting climates, the myths feel closer than ever. Coastal cities flood, island nations disappear, shorelines retreat, communities relocate. What was once theoretical becomes personal. We are living through processes that ancient people experienced without explanation. And like them, we tell stories, some scientific, some political, some moral, all attempts to impose meaning on change. The danger is not that we will invent new Atlantean myths. The danger is that we will ignore the lessons embedded in the old ones. Lost continents are not warnings about the past. They are warnings about continuity. They remind us that stability is temporary, that memory is fragile, and that adaptation is not optional. They tell us that the earth does not need intention to erase us, only motion. Modern science prides itself on precision, measurement, and skepticism. It demands evidence, repeatability, and restraint. And yet, when it peers deep enough into the past, it encounters something strangely familiar to myth: uncertainty. The deeper we look, the less complete the picture becomes. This is not a failure of science. It is an honest confrontation with time. Human history does not dissolve neatly into layers. It fractures, it scatters, it disappears. Fire destroys, water buries. Stone erodes, organic material decays. What survives does so unevenly, by chance as much as by design. When we reconstruct the past, we are not uncovering a finished story. We are assembling fragments, shards of pottery, traces of charcoal, anomalies in soil chemistry, and asking them to speak. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they contradict one another, sometimes they remain silent, and silence is where imagination enters. For much of the 20th century, archaeology was guided by a powerful assumption that the oldest civilizations must be inland, agricultural, and monumental. Coastlines were considered secondary, temporary, peripheral. This assumption made sense given what could be easily studied, but ease is not truth. As methods improved, cracks appeared in the narrative. Evidence emerged of complex societies thriving in environments previously thought unsuitable. Monumental structures appeared where agriculture should not yet exist. Long-distance trade networks predated cities. Each discovery pushed the boundary backward, not smoothly, violently. Timelines were revised, theories collapsed, certainty eroded. And beneath all of this, a quiet realization formed: we may have been looking in the wrong places. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. Yet the overwhelming majority of archaeological research has focused on the remaining fraction. This imbalance is not philosophical, it is practical. The ocean is difficult, expensive, dangerous, but difficulty does not negate relevance. If early humans favored coastlines, then the ocean hides not anomalies but norms. This reframes everything. What we call the dawn of civilization may not be the beginning at all. It may be the re-emergence of patterns that existed earlier, were disrupted, and then reinvented elsewhere. This idea is deeply unsettling because it undermines linear progress. It suggests that human ingenuity does not move forward forever, but cycles. That knowledge can be lost, that adaptation can fail, not globally, not uniformly, but locally, repeatedly. Lost continent myths persist because they express this unease long before science had language for it. They say there were people before us who knew things we do not. They say land we depended on is gone. They say memory is not enough. In this way, myth does not oppose science, it anticipates it. As technology improves, we are now beginning to test the limits of these intuitions. High-resolution seafloor mapping reveals submerged coastlines with extraordinary clarity. Ancient river deltas stretch across continental shelves. Stone structures appear where nature alone struggles to explain them. Each discovery is met with excitement and caution, because science has learned humility the hard way. Every generation has believed it was close to understanding everything. Every generation has been wrong. The tension between myth and science is not a battle, it is a dialogue. Myth asks questions science cannot yet answer. Science answers questions myth asked imperfectly. When the two align too closely, danger arises because myth becomes mistaken for evidence. But when they ignore each other entirely, something is lost. Atlantis and Lemuria should not be treated as destinations to be found. They should be treated as signals that humans have long suspected that their past is deeper than they can see. There's a reason that people resist letting these myths go. They offer continuity. They say, even if knowledge is lost, it once existed. Even if civilizations fall, they are not meaningless. Even if memory fades, something endures. This is emotionally powerful and scientifically dangerous if taken literally. But emotionally powerful ideas often contain psychological truth. And psychological truth matters. Consider what it means for a culture to lose its homeland. This is not abstract, it is not rare. It has happened throughout history through invasion, environmental change, and disaster. Languages disappear, rituals fade, identity fragments. Now expand this loss across millennia. Entire ways of thinking vanish. We assume that because writing did not survive, thought did not exist. This assumption is false. Human intelligence did not suddenly ignite with agriculture. It evolved gradually. It expressed itself through oral tradition, symbolic behavior, and complex social structures long before permanent cities. Much of that expression left no durable trace. This is not romanticism, it is reality. The idea of a lost continent is compelling because it externalizes this loss. It gives it shape, geography, boundaries. It is easier to mourn a place than an absence. Atlantis gives form to the fear that sophistication can be erased. Lemuria gives form to the grief that harmony can vanish. But the real loss may be more subtle, not continents, but conversations, not cities, but knowledge. Science is beginning to acknowledge this fragility. Fields like cognitive archaeology, anthropology, and systems theory increasingly emphasize that human development is not simply technological. It is cultural, and culture is fragile. Remove enough people. Disrupt enough connections. Change the environment fast enough, and complexity collapses, not into nothing, but into something simpler. Then over time, complexity returns, but it is not the same. This is where the future intersects with the past. We often think of collapse as an endpoint, but collapse is also a transition. After the fall of a civilization, humans do not disappear. They adapt, they simplify, they remember fragments, they tell stories. Those stories may be misunderstood later. They may be dismissed as myth, but they carry echoes. Imagine a future thousands of years from now. Our cities lie beneath sediment, our data is unreadable, our languages are extinct. Future humans excavate fragments, concrete slabs, twisted metal, unnatural layers in rock. They argue, was this natural? Was it artificial? Was it global? Was it symbolic? Some insist it was myth, others insist it was real. They create stories. And those stories say more about them than about us. This is not hypothetical, it is inevitable. Lost continent myths are not about proving something existed. They are about preparing for the possibility that it did not endure. They teach us that disappearance is normal. What is rare is continuity. As we approach the final arc of this long narration, the question shifts. Not did Atlantis or Lemuria exist, but what does it mean that we keep asking? What does it say about us that we are drawn to stories of lost worlds, submerged lands, forgotten knowledge? It says we sense our own impermanence, and we are trying to make peace with it. Civilizations do not collapse because they forget the past. They collapse because they misunderstand the present. This misunderstanding is almost always rooted in the same illusion, permanence. Every society, no matter how advanced, quietly assumes continuity. It assumes tomorrow will resemble today closely enough that long-term systems will hold. Food will arrive, water will flow, borders will remain meaningful, knowledge will be transferable, memory will persist. Lost world myths exist because this assumption has failed before, not once, not rarely, but repeatedly. And each time it failed, those who lived through the transition told stories, not to preserve accuracy, but to preserve meaning. When a civilization collapses, the first thing to go is not buildings or technology. It is coordination. The invisible threads that hold complexity together, trade routes, shared language, institutional memory, trust. Once those threads fray, knowledge becomes localized. Skills that once relied on large networks become impossible to maintain. Specialization fades, redundancy disappears. What remains is what can be carried, remembered, taught directly. This is why collapse feels like amnesia. Not everything is lost at once, but enough is lost that the world feels smaller. And when the world feels smaller, the past begins to feel larger. Atlantis emerges here not as a city, but as a symbol of what was once possible. There is a quiet pattern that repeats across human history. After collapse, societies look backward. They mythologize what came before. They compress centuries into single images. They attribute loss to moral failure or cosmic order. This is not ignorance. It is survival. A shattered culture needs coherence. It needs a story that explains why things changed and how to live within the new reality. Myth provides that framework when data is gone. This is why Atlantis is often described as falling due to arrogance. It offers a lesson simple enough to endure when details are lost. And this is why Lemuria is often described as peaceful and enlightened. It offers something to mourn. Both serve psychological functions. But there is another function that is rarely acknowledged. Lost world myths preserve a warning without preserving specifics. They say something like this can happen, not exactly this, not in the same way, but close enough to matter. The story survives because it is adaptable. One of the most dangerous assumptions modern societies make is that knowledge is cumulative. That once discovered, it cannot be undiscovered. That once written, it cannot be lost. History contradicts this. Libraries have burned. Languages have vanished. Techniques have disappeared. Entire fields of knowledge have been forgotten and later reinvented without awareness of their earlier existence. What survives is not what is true, but what is transmitted, and transmission depends on stability. This is where lost continent myths intersect uncomfortably with the modern world. We live in an era of unprecedented information density. Knowledge is stored digitally, distributed globally, accessed instantly. It feels indestructible, but it is fragile in ways previous generations never faced. Digital information requires infrastructure, energy, maintenance, compatibility, continuity. Remove enough of these and vast portions of modern knowledge become inaccessible, not destroyed but unreadable. A civilization does not need to disappear for its memory to fail, it only needs disruption. Atlantis, in this sense, is not about sinking land, it is about collapsing systems. The sea is symbolic. It represents forces that overwhelm complexity without intent. Time, change, entropy. Lemuria, too, is not about a physical continent. It is about a mode of being that could not survive a shift in conditions. Neither myth requires literal truth to be relevant. They require resonance. There is a quiet irony in the way modern culture treats these stories. On one hand, they are dismissed as fantasy. On the other, they are endlessly retold in fiction, documentaries, and speculation. This contradiction exists because we do not know how to engage with uncertainty. We either demand proof or we escape into imagination. What we struggle to do is sit with ambiguity. But ambiguity is where the truth of lost worlds lives. Science at its best acknowledges this. It does not claim finality. It refines, it revises, it corrects itself. Yet even science operates within constraints, funding, access, political will, cultural priorities. Entire lines of inquiry can be neglected not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Underwater archaeology is a perfect example. We know submerged landscapes exist. We know humans lived along ancient coasts. We know sea levels rose dramatically. And yet exploration remains limited, not because it is unimportant, but because it is difficult. This creates a vacuum, and vacuums attract myth. The danger is not that myths exist. The danger is that we use them to avoid responsibility. If Atlantis fell because of divine punishment, then collapse is inevitable and beyond control. If Lemuria vanished because of cosmic cycles, then nothing can be done. But if lost worlds fell because systems failed to adapt to change, then responsibility returns, and responsibility is uncomfortable. There is a reason that the most unsettling version of Atlantis is not one filled with crystals, energy beams, or advanced machines. The most unsettling version is the simplest one, a coastal society, highly organized, dependent on trade and stable climate, gradually undermined by environmental change, forced to retreat, fragmented, forgotten, because that version does not belong to the distant past, it belongs to the present. Lost continents remind us that geography is not destiny. What matters is adaptability. Civilizations that assume stability break when it fails. Civilizations that anticipate change endure longer, but none endure forever. This realization leads to a final, uncomfortable thought. What if the greatest lost continent is not beneath the ocean, but beneath our assumptions? What if we are blind not because evidence is missing, but because we expect the wrong kind of evidence? Stone monuments survive. Wooden cultures do not. Written language persists. Oral tradition fades. We privilege what endures and mistake it for importance. But importance is not measured by durability. As this narration moves forward, the question is no longer about proving ancient myths. It is about learning how to live with impermanence, how to build systems that accept change, how to preserve knowledge without assuming permanence, how to tell stories that warn without paralyzing. Lost worlds are not ghosts, they are teachers. To carry memory forward deliberately is one of the most difficult tasks a civilization can attempt. It requires humility, the acceptance that what exists now will not exist forever. It requires foresight, the willingness to imagine futures where present systems fail. And it requires restraint, the understanding that not all knowledge can be preserved in the same way. Ancient societies understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the language to articulate it. They encoded memory into ritual, into story, into symbol. They repeated key narratives not because they were accurate in every detail, but because repetition was survival. A story told often enough outlives its origin. Atlantis and Lemuria are not preserved because they were written once. They are preserved because they were retold, again and again, across centuries, across cultures, across changing worldviews. This is how memory resists erasure, not by resisting change, but by adapting to it. Modern civilization, by contrast, often assumes that storage is preservation. That writing something down, archiving it, or uploading it ensures continuity. But storage without transmission is fragile. A hard drive without power is silent. A language without speakers is dead. A book without readers is inert. Preservation is not a material problem. It is a social one. This is a lesson lost world myths try to teach quietly beneath their drama. They say, remember actively or forget entirely. When we imagine ancient knowledge being lost, we often imagine it being destroyed, burned, smashed, submerged. But far more often it simply becomes irrelevant. Practices suited to one environment fail in another. Skills dependent on certain resources lose value. Knowledge that once solved pressing problems becomes obsolete. And when knowledge stops being useful, it stops being taught. This is the most effective erasure of all. No catastrophe required. Consider how quickly modern skills become outdated, technologies obsolete within decades, methods abandoned, entire professions disappear. This is not collapse, it is change. Now imagine this process accelerated by environmental instability, political fragmentation, or resource scarcity. What is not immediately useful is not preserved, and what is not preserved is forgotten. Lost continents do not need earthquakes to disappear. They need indifference. This is why the search for Atlantis often feels misguided. People look for ruins because ruins are comforting. They are solid, visible, tangible, but the most significant losses are intangible. Worldviews, systems of meaning, ways of organizing life. These leave no ruins, only echoes. If Atlantis existed as a real place in any form, it would not be recognizable as the Atlantis of legend. It would be mundane in many ways, familiar, human. Its significance would not lie in extraordinary technology, but in its vulnerability, and its disappearance would not be dramatic enough to match the story, which is why the story changed. Myths grow because memory shrinks. As details fade, symbolism expands. The sea becomes judgment, the fall becomes moral, the place becomes perfect or corrupt beyond realism. This is not deception, it is compression. Human memory compresses complex events into narratives that can survive repetition. What is lost in accuracy is gained in endurance. Lemuria follows the same path. Originally a scientific hypothesis, it should have died when evidence replaced it, but it did not because it filled an emotional need science did not address. Science explained how continents move. It did not explain how loss feels. Lemuria became a vessel for that feeling, a place that was not destroyed by greed or hubris, but by inevitability, a place that was gentle, a place that did not deserve to vanish. This distinction matters because it reveals that not all lost world myths are warnings, some are elegies. As we approach the deeper layers of this subject, it becomes clear that the persistence of these myths is not accidental. They serve as cultural pressure valves. They allow societies to process fear of collapse without confronting it directly. They allow grief without naming the loss. They allow humility without surrender. But myths alone cannot guide action. They can only shape perception. What we do with that perception determines whether the lesson is learned or ignored. The earth does not preserve fairness, it preserves processes. Glaciers melt when temperatures rise, seas rise when ice melts, land sinks when tectonics demand it. These are not punishments, they are mechanics. Ancient people personified them because personification made them comprehensible. Modern people risk ignoring them because abstraction makes them feel distant. Both responses miss something essential. Change does not require belief, it requires preparation. Lost continents remind us that no environment is guaranteed. Coastlines shift, climate zones migrate, resources redistribute. Civilizations that anchor themselves too rigidly to one configuration of the world place a bet against geology, and geology always wins. There is a profound difference between resilience and permanence. Resilience accepts loss and reorganizes. Permanence denies loss until it becomes catastrophic. Lost world myths survive because they show permanence failing. They are cautionary tales for systems that confuse stability with security. When we look back at Atlantis and Lemuria, we should not ask whether they were real places. We should ask why we need them to be. What discomfort do they soothe? What fear do they externalize? What responsibility do they displace? Perhaps the most unsettling interpretation is this: Atlantis and Lemuria are not memories of the past. They are premonitions of the future, not in detail, but in structure. They describe societies that believed themselves secure, only to discover that the earth does not negotiate with belief. As we near the final movement of this long narration, the subject shifts from what was lost to what can be carried forward. Not monuments, not continents, but awareness. The awareness that nothing we build is immune to change. The awareness that knowledge must be actively transmitted. The awareness that humility is not weakness but adaptation. What is worth preserving is not a simple question because preservation implies choice, and choice implies values. Every civilization, whether consciously or not, decides what matters enough to carry forward and what can be left behind. These decisions shape not only what survives, but how the future understands the past. Lost worlds remind us that preservation is never neutral. Stone monuments survive because stone endures, not because stone is more meaningful than song. Written language survives because it can be copied, not because oral wisdom was inferior. Tools survive because they fossilize, not because relationships mattered less. What we inherit from the past is not a balanced record, it is a biased one, and knowing this changes how we interpret what is missing. When we imagine the loss of Atlantis or Lemuria, we often imagine the loss of physical achievements, cities, technologies, architecture. But what may have been lost, if anything was lost at all, are ways of seeing the world, ways of organizing life around different assumptions, ways of relating to the environment that did not translate well once conditions changed. These are the most fragile forms of knowledge because they are embedded in practice, not objects. Once the practice ends, the knowledge dissolves. Modern society often believes that it has solved this problem through documentation, through data storage, through redundancy, through scale, but scale is not resilience. Scale amplifies fragility. A system that works everywhere must fail everywhere when it breaks. Local knowledge, by contrast, fails locally. This distinction matters. Many ancient societies were deeply local. Their knowledge was tailored to specific landscapes, climates, and ecosystems. When those systems changed through rising seas, shifting rainfall, or ecological disruption, the knowledge lost relevance. Not because it was wrong, but because the world it described no longer existed. This is how worlds end quietly. Lost continents, whether literal or symbolic, represent thresholds, moments where continuity breaks. On one side of the threshold, knowledge makes sense. On the other, it does not. And without continuity, translation fails. The past becomes myth not because it is false, but because it is unintelligible. This is one reason why ancient myths often feel dreamlike or exaggerated. They are not lying, they are translating across incompatible contexts. A flood that unfolds over generations becomes a single night. A gradual retreat of coastlines becomes a sudden sinking. A complex web of causes becomes a moral failure. Compression is the price of survival. If Atlantis was ever inspired by real events, those events were likely far less dramatic than the story suggests, and far more difficult to narrate. How do you tell a story about incremental loss? How do you pass down a warning about slow change? You cannot, so you turn it into a catastrophe, because catastrophe is memorable. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Many of the greatest threats to civilizations are not dramatic enough to mythologize until it is too late. Slow climate shifts, gradual resource depletion, increasing systemic complexity, erosion of trust, loss of shared meaning. These do not feel like endings, they feel like normality, until suddenly they are not. Lost worlds are often imagined as victims of sudden disaster because sudden disaster is narratively satisfying. But the real lesson lies in the opposite direction. Civilizations do not usually fall because of one event, they fall because of accumulation. This accumulation is difficult to perceive from within. Each generation inherits a slightly altered world and adjusts. The change feels manageable. The future feels familiar. Then at some point the adjustments fail and the past becomes unrecognizable. Atlantis and Lemuria in this light are not stories about how worlds end. They are stories about how worlds fail to notice they are ending. This is why they resonate, not because we fear earthquakes or floods alone, but because we fear blindness. What then does it mean to preserve something meaningful in a world that will not stay still? It means prioritizing adaptability over durability. Stone monuments endure, but they do not teach flexibility. Written records preserve facts, but they do not guarantee understanding. The most resilient knowledge is not fixed, it is procedural. It is the knowledge of how to learn, how to adapt, how to reorganize when conditions change. This kind of knowledge is rarely celebrated. It leaves little trace, but it is what allows continuity across disruption. Ancient cultures that survived dramatic environmental change often did so not through superior technology, but through social structures that allowed rapid adaptation. Flexible identities, shared responsibilities, oral traditions that could evolve without breaking. These cultures are often dismissed as primitive because they left fewer monuments, but they endured, which raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps the civilizations most likely to be remembered are not the ones most likely to survive. Lost continents fascinate us because they invert our assumptions. They suggest that greatness is not a guarantee, that visibility is not permanence, that memory is selective, and that survival does not always look like progress. As we move closer to the end of this long journey, the focus shifts from the past to the present, not in search of blame, but in search of clarity. We are not unique. We are not exempt, we are not immune, but we are aware, and awareness changes the equation. The people who lived through rising seas at the end of the Ice Age did not understand the mechanisms behind what was happening. They did not know about ice sheets or orbital cycles or thermal expansion. They only knew that the world was changing. We understand more, but understanding does not automatically lead to wisdom. Wisdom requires restraint. It requires the courage to question assumptions of permanence. It requires the humility to plan for loss. Lost worlds teach us that continuity is not about holding onto everything. It is about choosing what matters most, values over structures, relationships over monuments, processes over products. This is not romanticism. It is pragmatism in deep time. If Atlantis and Lemuria mean anything at all, they mean this, that civilizations do not vanish because they are forgotten. They vanish because they fail to prepare for change, and when they do, memory is all that remains. To face impermanence without fear is perhaps the most difficult task a thinking species can attempt. Fear is the natural response to loss. It sharpens attention, accelerates action, and demands explanation. But fear also narrows vision. It pulls attention towards survival in the immediate sense, away from continuity in the deeper one. Lost worlds frighten us because they reveal a truth we rarely confront willingly. Nothing we build is guaranteed to last, and nothing we know is guaranteed to be remembered. Yet within that truth lies a paradox. If nothing lasts forever, then meaning cannot depend on permanence. It must depend on something else. Throughout this long journey, through myth, geology, archaeology, psychology, and memory, we have circled the same idea from different angles. Atlantis and Lemuria are not problems to be solved. They are questions to be lived with. They ask us not where ancient continents went, but how civilizations understand themselves in time. They ask whether progress is accumulation or adaptation. They ask whether remembrance is about accuracy or continuity. And ultimately, they ask whether humanity can accept limits without despair. There's a temptation to believe that if we could only uncover the truth, if we could map every submerged coastline, excavate every drowned settlement, reconstruct every lost culture, then the anxiety would disappear. The mystery would end, the story would be complete, but completion is not what we are seeking. We are seeking reassurance. Reassurance that what we do matters, even if it does not endure forever. Lost worlds unsettle us because they seem to deny that reassurance. They show us civilizations erased as if they never existed. They make effort appear futile. But this is a misunderstanding. Erasure is not the same as meaninglessness. A song sung once still shapes the singer. A life lived briefly still changes others. A culture that vanishes still alters the trajectory of those who follow. Meaning does not require endurance across millennia. It requires presence in time. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, mattered to the people who lived its story, if such people ever existed. Lemuria, whether scientific error or spiritual symbol, mattered to those who used it to articulate loss. Their significance does not depend on our ability to verify them. It depends on what they carried. When ancient peoples told stories of lost lands, they were not trying to deceive the future. They were trying to orient themselves in a world that had changed faster than they could explain. They were making sense of dislocation, of grief, of uncertainty. In that sense, they were doing exactly what we do today. We tell stories about climate change, collapse, and resilience. We debate causes and responsibilities. We imagine futures both hopeful and catastrophic. These, too, will be myths one day, not because they are false, but because they will be incomplete. The question then becomes, what kind of myth are we creating? One that paralyses or one that prepares? Lost continents teach us that stories shape response. If collapse is framed as punishment, people seek blame. If it is framed as inevitability, people surrender. But if it is framed as transition, people adapt. The difference lies not in facts, but in framing. Throughout history, societies that endured disruption were often those that accepted impermanence early. They did not cling to fixed identities or rigid systems. They built flexibility into their social structures. They valued knowledge transfer over accumulation. They prioritized relationships over monuments. They understood intuitively that the future would not resemble the past closely enough to preserve it intact. This is not resignation, it is realism. Atlantis in its most useful form is not a tragedy. It is a reminder that power creates dependency. That complexity increases fragility. That success can blind. Lemuria in its most useful form is not nostalgia. It is a warning that harmony does not exempt us from change, that gentleness does not guarantee survival, that even balanced systems must adapt or dissolve. Together they form a complete lesson, not do not build and not do not care, but do not assume. The earth has never promised stability. It offers patterns, cycles, and tendencies, but no guarantees. Ice ages come and go, seas rise and fall, land emerges and sinks, life adapts or disappears. This is not cruelty, it is process, and humanity is part of it, not above it. What makes our moment different is not the scale of change, but our awareness of it. We know seas are rising, we know climates are shifting. We know systems are interdependent and fragile. This knowledge is unprecedented, but knowledge alone is not enough. Without humility, it becomes arrogance. Without foresight, it becomes anxiety. Without wisdom, it becomes paralysis. Lost worlds challenge us to integrate knowledge with humility, to accept that we are not the culmination of history, to accept that what we build will be altered, repurposed, or erased, and to ask ourselves a question that ancient myths ask quietly beneath their drama. What do we want to be remembered for? Not by name, not by monument, but by influence. If the future remembers us at all, it will not remember our abundance or our technology in detail. It will remember patterns. It will remember whether we adapted or resisted, whether we learned or denied, whether we passed on tools for resilience or tools for domination. These patterns matter more than artifacts. Perhaps the most important shift is this: to stop thinking of loss as failure. Loss is inevitable. The question is whether loss is destructive or generative. A forest fire destroys, but it also renews. A flood erases, but it also reshapes. A civilization may end, but its influence may persist in altered forms. Atlantis and Lemuria as ideas are already examples of this. They have outlived their supposed geography. They have become frameworks. In the end, the deepest truth beneath the myths of lost continents is not that the past was greater or wiser or more advanced. It is that the past was human, subject to the same hopes, blind spots, fears, and limitations, and so are we. As this narration continues toward its final conclusion, the focus will no longer be on what vanished, but on what can be cultivated. Not permanence, but continuity of care, not certainty, but adaptability, not domination of the earth, but alignment with its rhythms. These are not ancient ideals, they are timeless necessities. Lost worlds are not warnings carved in stone, they are invitations written in water, invitations to listen to change before it becomes catastrophe. Invitations to value knowledge not for its power, but for its transferability. Invitations to accept that the measure of a civilization is not how long it lasts, but how well it prepares those who come after. We have reached the quiet edge of this journey, not an ending in the usual sense, but a resting place, a shoreline where everything we have explored begins to settle. We began with lost continents, with Atlantis and Lemuria, with myths that seemed at first glance to ask only one question: did these places really exist? But along the way the question changed, it deepened, and now at the end it has become something else entirely. Atlantis no longer feels like a location. Lemuria no longer feels like a map. They feel like reflections, reflections of how humans understand time, loss, and meaning. They are not instructions left behind by an ancient civilization. They are signals emerging again and again across cultures to remind us that the earth is older than memory, stronger than certainty, and indifferent to intention. They tell us that land can disappear, that knowledge can vanish, that continuity is fragile, but they also tell us something quieter and far more important. They tell us that humans notice when the world changes, and when they notice, they remember imperfectly, symbolically, emotionally, but they remember. Across this entire narration, we have seen the same pattern repeat. The earth changes, humans adapt, memory compresses experience into story. Story outlives detail. This is not failure, it is survival. When ancient coastlines drowned, people did not record sea level curves or tectonic mechanisms. They recorded loss, they recorded displacement, they recorded fear and awe. And when those records traveled across generations, they transformed. Gradual change became sudden catastrophe. Complex causes became moral lessons, places became symbols. Atlantis sank in a night. Lemuria faded into legend, not because that is what literally happened, but because that is what could be remembered. Science does not invalidate this process. Science explains it. It shows us that seas really did rise, that lands really did drown, that humans really did lose places they depended on. That vast chapters of human experience lie beneath the ocean, inaccessible not because they are imaginary, but because they are submerged. But science also shows us something else. It shows us that the earth has no memory. Rocks do not remember cities. Sediment does not remember names. Oceans do not preserve intention. Only humans remember, and that makes memory precious. What we choose to remember shapes how we live. If we remember the past as a straight line of progress, we grow arrogant. If we remember it as inevitable collapse, we grow helpless. But if we remember it as a series of adaptations, some successful, some not, we gain perspective. Lost worlds are not proof that civilization is doomed. They are proof that civilization is conditional, dependent on environment, dependent on cooperation, dependent on awareness. The most dangerous belief a civilization can hold is not that it will end, but that it cannot. Atlantis falls again and again in our stories because it believes itself secure. Lemuria fades because it is unprepared for change. These are not opposites. They are two sides of the same misunderstanding. We do not need to fear impermanence. We need to understand it. The earth does not demand despair. It demands alignment. When we align with its rhythms, its cycles, its limits, its slow but unstoppable forces, we build systems that bend instead of break. When we deny those rhythms, we build monuments to certainty that cannot endure. This is not an ancient lesson, it is a present one. Perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is believing that meaning depends on endurance, that if something does not last forever, it does not matter, but nothing lasts forever. And yet everything matters while it exists. A culture matters because it shapes lives. A story matters because it shapes choices. A civilization matters because it alters the trajectory of what comes next. Atlantis, real or imagined, mattered to those who told its story. Lemuria mattered to those who used it to mourn what was lost. And our world matters now, not because it will endure unchanged, but because it will influence what follows. We are not standing at the end of history, we are standing inside it. And one day others will look back toward us through fragments, through myths, through incomplete evidence, and they will tell stories. Those stories will not be accurate, they will be meaningful. They will compress our complexity into symbols. They will turn our gradual changes into sudden endings. They will ask what went wrong and what went right. So the final question is not whether Atlantis or Lemuria existed. The final question is what we do with the knowledge that worlds can be lost. Do we deny it? Do we romanticize it, or do we learn from it? Learning does not mean preventing all loss. It means choosing what we carry forward, values, practices, ways of thinking that prioritize adaptability over dominance, humility over certainty, continuity over permanence. These are the things that survive not because they are written in stone, but because they are lived. If there is one lesson beneath all lost continent myths, it is this: the earth will continue. Civilizations will not, but understanding can. And understanding is not found in ruins, it is found in awareness. As we end this journey, imagine the oceans not as emptiness, but as memory's shadow. Imagine the drowned landscapes not as tragedy, but as reminders. Reminders that change is not the enemy. Unawareness is. Thank you for staying with this story, from the first questions about lost continents to the deeper reflections beneath them. If you found this journey meaningful, I invite you to subscribe so you can continue exploring Earth's deep history, hidden patterns, and quiet mysteries with us. And I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Every place on Earth carries its own story, its own memory, its own connection to this planet we share. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, the world is always changing. The question is whether we are paying attention.